Hey everybody, how's it going? It's me, Logan Joyce, aka Suburban Yinzer. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the American Civil War, my analysis and my opinion on the American Civil War. What do I think and what do I believe? Well, I can tell yins that as a descendant of Virginia ancestors that fought for the Confederacy and Pennsylvania ancestors that fought for the Union, I'm divided. Just like the nation was divided from 1861 to 1865, I feel, in my opinion, that the Civil War is probably my most favorite era of American history, not just military, but also political, too. It was such a decisive and divided time in the nation's history. But the problem is, in 2025, or in just the modern era in general, we have been swayed and blinded with arrogance and ignorance when it comes to that era of American history and American politics in general. So in this video, I hope to enlighten yins and maybe shed a little bit of difference of opinion and maybe a little bit of truth when it comes to that era of American history. So, my ancestors from Virginia fought for the Confederate States of America. And many people nowadays might slander them and say that they are traitors to the Union, that they seceded against the Union without permission and they had no right to do it, and they committed treason, and that they're not honorable and they're not worth mentioning. Nothing they did was worth it, right? Because they fought for slavery or some type of propaganda, some type of post-Civil War propaganda that is so defamatory and so slanderous, it just makes me just shake my head and just think this is the most stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. How can you disgrace and how can you erase 4 years of honorable military history, American history, our history? How can you slander it? How can you slander the men that you never met, that you really never knew, an era that you never grew up in? I think presentism is a cancer to this country and to the society. Presentism means, being a presentist means that you feel, with your own opinions, that the era that you never grew up in, that happened way before you, should be erased. That you should judge everybody that grew up during the Civil War, or fought during the Civil War, or lived during the Civil War, should be erased and should be demonized because they owned slaves or because they supported slavery. I mean, how stupid does that sound? Think about it. In 2025, we're judging people that lived 160 years ago on our present laws or our present views. I think it's absolutely ignorant. But in this video, that's just the baseline. That's just the introduction. So what are my opinions or what are my analysis of the Civil War? Let's get to the core of the issue. I feel that the Union was fighting that war to preserve the Union. I feel that my Pennsylvania ancestors on my mom and dad's side that fought for Pennsylvania, I feel that they were fighting to preserve the Union. Did it have anything to do with slavery? Yes and no. The Union was not solely fighting for slavery in the beginning of the war. They were fighting to preserve the Union. And Abraham Lincoln made that clear. That is undeniable. Most Union generals and most Union soldiers from 1861 to 1863 stated that they were fighting solely to preserve the Union, the integrity and the strength of the federal government and the powers of the federal government. Slavery didn't become a major core issue of the war until the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was solely a political document for Lincoln to divide Britain away from the Civil War, because Great Britain was getting very mad at Abraham Lincoln. The British were very tired of Abraham Lincoln's blockades and Abraham Lincoln's games. I am not a supporter of Abraham Lincoln whatsoever. I feel that Abraham Lincoln disgraced the Constitution, he disgraced the integrity of the Union, and that he is not a hero that we can make him out to be today. That man has been shed, or has been painted as a savior, a prophet, a genius, but I don't think so. I think he was an honorable man in some aspects, but I don't think he was this dynamic, amazing genius guy that we make him out to be. We make him out to be sort of like a Lord and Savior on the same level as Jesus. I feel that sometimes in American legend or American lore that Abraham Lincoln is painted as a honestly like a prophet. But in my opinion, I don't think so. Abraham Lincoln was not this great saint that we make him out to be. Abraham Lincoln was a man. Abraham Lincoln was greedy. Abraham Lincoln sinned. Abraham Lincoln was flawed. And I personally don't respect anybody that doesn't see both sides of the story and doesn't analyze every aspect of that war and every aspect of every politician. Because in my opinion, politicians are corrupt. Most politicians are not doing what they're doing to benefit the country or benefit other people. It's to benefit themselves or their special interests. And in the aspect of Abraham Lincoln, that's what it was about. But let's go to the opposing view. So why do I not like Abraham Lincoln? Well, this is where I support the Confederate States of America. This is where I support my Virginia ancestors who fought for 4 years for their freedom and for their independence. Just like their American Revolutionary ancestors did in 1776 against Great Britain. The Confederate States of America is not treason. They weren't traitors. They didn't betray the principles of the Union. They upheld them. They upheld the Union. But the Constitution of the United States was being perverted by the northern states. The North was not allowing the slave states to extend slavery into the western territories. Before the Civil War, there was a huge political and economic divide between the North and the South that had been brewing since Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson in the 1790s and 1800s. Everybody thinks the Civil War was started because of John Brown or the Fugitive Slave Act or the 1850s in general. But it is a lie. It's a perversion to history. The Civil War was created and was started decades before, even before Lincoln. The Civil War was a creation, or was a pileup of decades and decades of partisan sectional politics and sectional economics. We, in modern times, feel that the Civil War started in 1861, and in my opinion, the Civil War started in 1789. When the Union was created, there was a huge sectional divide between the North and the South. The northern states, which were the free states, and the southern states, which were the slave states. But in my personal opinion, that economic and cultural divide festered decade after decade after decade. But there was a political shift. There was a political equilibrium. But then, during the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the northern states, the free states per se, got greedy. And instead of creating the equilibrium, instead of maintaining that balance of the Union, they started being corrupt. They took their greed and their corruption and they let it fester. They used politics, they used industrial special interests to make themselves more delusional in their greed. Meaning that instead of maintaining the equilibrium and the equality of the Union, they started to suppress the South. They started to discriminate against the South. The Union was supposed to be a compact, an agreement between both sides. The North was not supposed to be the strong industrial empire that abused the South. And the South was not supposed to be the strong agrarian empire that abused the North. It was an equilibrium. It was a compromise. But what the North did is they got more greedy. They got more greedy and more powerful, and they started abusing the South and dictating to the South what they were going to do. The South was going to pay more taxes. They were going to pay more tariffs. They were going to have less representation in Congress. The South was going to have less of a voice in Congress. So what is the South going to do? The South is going to secede from the Union. Just like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, they created their own country. That's called the Confederate States of America. What choice did the North give them? The South begged and pleaded for decade after decade after decade, which Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, stated many times, that we begged, we pleaded for peace. We wanted a compromise. We wanted the equilibrium. They wanted to bring slaves into the Western territories, not as a racial superiority, not as a white-dominated society. They just wanted, it really had nothing to do with racism. It had to do with political and economic equality. It was to be able to compete against the northern industrial hubs like New York City, Boston, Chicago, Pittsburgh, etc. It was to be able to compete with them. It was to be able to compete with the northern industry. But if the northern politicians who were in hand with the industrial leaders, how are you going to have any type of fairness or any type of equality when the South is just a piggy bank supporting the northern states? So what would happen is that the northern states would abuse the southern states, prevent them from thriving or succeeding economically and politically, which would then strong arm the southern states to secede from the Union, which they had every right to do. The Union was a voluntary compact. It was a voluntary agreement all the way back to 1787, when the Constitution was first being written by James Madison. The Union is not a forced compromise. It is a voluntary compromise. Every state, basically the 13 original states, agreed to come into the Union. So why couldn't one state secede from the Union if they felt that their needs and their wants were being abused? But that's what the South did. They upheld that principle of secession. They came all the way back to 1776 when we seceded from Great Britain. To say that the Confederates are traitors and the Confederates are evil and they're bad is to basically demonize and slander the founding fathers of 1776. Because how do you think the Confederacy and the Confederates got the ideas? How did they get the blueprints to secede from the Union? It was George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It was the founding fathers that inspired and motivated them to do what they did in 1861. So in my personal opinion, that war was perpetuated and built decade after decade after decade of abuse of the Southern agrarian society, the Southern plantation owners. And by the time 1861 hit, the volcano exploded, which caused the Great Secession, which caused the Southern Rebellion. And that is basically my opinion. That is the core political and economic issue of the war. Slavery was just a branch. Slavery was just a symptom. But when it came to the North and the South, those divisions and those disagreements were brewing all the way back to the beginning of the Union. There was always a divide. There was always tension between both sides of the United States of America. The Union was not going to withstand. The Union was not going to be forever peaceful. The Civil War was inevitable. When you have corrupt politicians in the North who are more concerned about industrial special interest and money, when you have that greed and that power brewing with the railroads, the iron mills, and then what's going to happen is they need money to feed that. So they're going to abuse and neglect the Southern agrarian plantation owners and make them pay for it with tariffs, with taxes, because the South was dependable on those imported goods. This is all from the mouth of Jefferson Davis. This is from the mouth of a man that lived during that time, who was in the Senate during that time. I'm not a presentist. I don't look back on history and judge with blindness. I judge with the words of the witnesses who lived during that time on both sides, because it takes both sides to tango. There's both sides to that war. And anybody that says they're pro-Union or pro-Confederacy or pro-North, pro-South, anybody who's blind and slanders and defames either side. In my opinion, if you defame and you slander with blindness or ignorance, and you do not read and you do not study and you do not analyze every aspect of that war, every aspect of that time, or every person that lived during that time, you are stupid. You are an idiot. Because only an idiot and only a moron, to be frank, to be a little honest, you do not analyze history that way. You do not demonize and slander and blacklist. You have an open mind. You be diverse. You be liberal. You be open-minded. And you analyze every single minute aspect of that time. And that's what I have done. I've read book after book after book. I've studied long hours to make these conclusions, to make these analyses. In my personal opinion, my beliefs are my beliefs and your beliefs are your beliefs. Take it with a grain of salt. That's just how I feel. Peace.